Hey guys, tonight we are going to drift gently backward through time into a quieter world, one lit by firelight and softened by falling snow. This is a story meant to be listened to slowly, a story to rest your thoughts, a story that unfolds like a long winter evening with nothing urgent to do and nowhere you need to be. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we are stepping into the medieval world to explore why surviving winter in those distant centuries was so quietly difficult, and how ordinary people endured the long, cold months with patience, habit, and quiet resilience. There will be no battles here, no sudden dangers, just the slow rhythm of winter life, unfolding one soft moment at a time. As autumn faded in medieval Europe, the world seemed to exhale. The last leaves clung weakly to bare branches, their colors muted by mist and cold rain. Fields that had been lively with harvest carts and voices now lay flat and still, dark earth pressed under pale skies. For medieval people, winter was not a season of celebration or novelty. It was something to prepare for, to endure, and to survive with care. There were no forecasts, no central heating, no electric light to stretch the day. Winter arrived when it wished, often earlier than expected, and lingered longer than hoped. Villages grew quieter as the days shortened. Chickens huddled close to walls. Livestock were brought in from distant grazing lands and crowded into barns that smelled of hay, manure, and warm breath. The air itself seemed heavier, slower, as if sound traveled less willingly through the cold. Homes, small and dark even in summer, became the center of life. Most medieval houses were built with survival in mind, not comfort. Thick walls of stone or timber held back wind, but they also trapped dampness. Earthen floors stayed cold year-round. Smoke from the hearth drifted upward, escaping through holes in the roof or gaps between beams, leaving a faint haze that stung the eyes but kept insects away. In winter, the hearth was everything. Fire was warmth. Fire was light. Fire was life. But fire required fuel, and fuel was never endless. Wood had been gathered and stacked carefully throughout autumn. Each log mattered. Families learned to burn slowly, feeding the flames just enough to keep frost from creeping into fingers and toes. At night, embers were banked under ash, guarded like treasure, so they could be coaxed back into flame by morning. Letting a fire die completely was a small disaster. Relighting it meant effort, sparks, patience, sometimes hours of work with flint and steel while breath fogged the air and hands stiffened. As snow began to fall, the world outside narrowed. Paths disappeared beneath white layers. Familiar landmarks softened, rounded by ice. Travel slowed to a careful trudge, boots crunching over frozen ground. For many villagers, winter meant staying close to home for weeks at a time. Isolation was common. A neighboring village just a few miles away might feel unreachable after a heavy snowfall. Messages traveled slowly, carried by foot or cart when weather allowed. News arrived late, if at all. Inside the home, days blended together. There were no clocks ticking loudly on walls. Time was measured by daylight, by meals, by the steady routine of tending animals and maintaining warmth. Morning began when pale light filtered through shutter cracks. Evening came early, folding the day into darkness long before modern minds would expect. Food became a constant, quiet concern. By winter, fresh produce was gone. Gardens slept beneath frost. Fruit trees stood bare. What remained was what had been preserved. Grain stored in bins. Dried peas and beans. Salted meat hanging stiff and dark from beams. Cheese wrapped carefully in cloth. Root vegetables buried in cool cellars. Meals were simple and repetitive, but familiar. Porridge thickened with water or milk. Bread baked from coarse flour. Stews simmered slowly, stretching small amounts of meat with vegetables and grain. Flavor came from herbs saved from summer, if any remained. Hunger was not always dramatic. Often it was quiet. A smaller portion, a thinner broth, a lingering emptiness that became normal. Children learned early not to waste food. Every crumb mattered. Every bone was boiled again for one more bit of nourishment. Cold crept in regardless. Even near the fire, drafts slipped through door cracks and window shutters. Frost traced patterns on walls. Breath puffed white indoors on especially bitter mornings. Sleep came heavy and early. Families often slept together, not for affection alone, but for warmth. Bodies shared heat under wool blankets and rough linens. Clothing was worn to bed. Caps stayed on heads. Shoes were placed close to embers so they wouldn't freeze stiff overnight. Night was long. Without artificial light, candles were precious. Tallow was saved carefully. Darkness filled the house once the fire dimmed. Sounds became clearer, the wind pressing against walls, the shifting of animals in nearby stalls, the soft breathing of others nearby. Outside, winter ruled quietly. Rivers slowed beneath ice. Forests stood hushed, branches creaking faintly under snow's weight. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for spring that felt impossibly distant. Illness was an unspoken fear. Cold weakened bodies. Poor nutrition made recovery slow. A simple cough could linger all season. Medical knowledge was limited, remedies based on herbs, prayers, and tradition. People relied on rest and hope as much as anything else. Still, life continued. Tools were repaired by firelight. Clothes were mended again and again. Stories were told softly, passed down through generations. Songs were hummed under breath, familiar and comforting. Winter was not dramatic every day. Mostly, it was steady. A test of patience. A lesson in endurance. A season that asked people to live smaller, quieter lives. And in that quiet, medieval people learned how to wait. The winter deepened as the weeks passed, settling into a kind of stillness that medieval people knew well. Snow no longer felt new or remarkable. It became part of the landscape, a constant companion that softened sound and slowed every movement. Footsteps were careful now, placed deliberately to avoid slipping on ice hidden beneath thin layers of frost. Inside the village, smoke rose in thin columns from rooftops, drifting lazily before dissolving into the pale sky. These small signs of warmth were comforting, quiet proof that life continued behind closed doors. For many households, winter meant sharing space not only with family, but with animals as well. Cows, goats, sheep, and sometimes pigs were brought closer to human dwellings to protect them from the cold and predators. Their body heat added a small but valuable warmth to the air. The sounds of animals shifting, breathing, and occasionally bleeding became part of the night's rhythm. The smell was strong, earthy, and unavoidable, but familiar. Cleanliness was a relative concept in medieval winter. Bathing was rare, not from neglect, but from necessity. Water was cold. Heating it required precious fuel. Illness was believed to enter the body through cold and damp, so washing was approached cautiously. Instead, people wiped their hands and faces with cloths, changed linens when possible, and accepted a certain closeness to the physical realities of life. Clothing was layered carefully. Wool was prized, not for softness, but for warmth and durability. Tunics were worn over undershirts. Cloaks wrapped tightly around shoulders. Mittens and hats were essential, especially for children and elders whose bodies struggled most against the cold. Shoes were stiff and often poorly insulated. Straw or scraps of cloth might be stuffed inside for extra warmth. Feet went numb easily. Frostbite was a real danger, especially for those who had to work outdoors. Woodcutters, shepherds checking animals, messengers moving between settlements. Winter work did not disappear, it simply changed. Fields lay dormant, but barns needed attention. Animals required feeding and care. Tools were repaired. Fences were mended when weather allowed. Inside, spinning, weaving, and sewing filled the long hours. Hands stayed busy, not just to prepare for spring, but to keep circulation flowing and minds occupied. Light was limited. During the shortest days, sunlight barely crept above the horizon before slipping away again. Work was arranged around this fragile window. Tasks requiring detail were done near doorways or windows while light lasted. Once darkness fell, movement slowed. Firelight flickered across walls, creating soft, shifting shadows. Faces appeared and disappeared in the glow. Stories grew quieter, words chosen carefully, as if loud voices might disturb the fragile warmth of the room. Children learned early to entertain themselves without toys as we know them. They listened. They watched. They absorbed the rhythms of adult life, the scraping of bowls, the turning of spindle whorls, the steady crackle of firewood. Sleep patterns changed in winter. Many people practiced what historians now call segmented sleep. They slept for a few hours, woke during the deepest part of the night, then returned to rest again. This waking time was quiet and unhurried. Some prayed softly. Others talked in low voices. A few tended the fire or checked animals. There was no pressure to fill every moment. Time moved differently in winter, stretching and folding in on itself. Food supplies were checked often. A careful household head knew exactly how much grain remained, how many salted meats hung from beams, how long the cheese might last. Calculations were made silently, day by day, measuring survival against the calendar. Festivals offered brief moments of warmth and light. Midwinter celebrations, shaped by both Christian and older traditions, brought communities together when travel allowed. Candles were lit. Simple feasts were shared. Songs echoed softly in wooden halls and stone churches. For a short while, winter felt less heavy, but celebrations were modest. Excess was rare, and restraint was necessary. A feast today could mean hunger later. Even joy was measured carefully, stretched gently across the season. Illness lingered quietly in the background of daily life. Colds and coughs were common. Fevers came and went. Without modern medicine, recovery depended on rest, warmth, and the strength of the body itself. Elders were especially vulnerable. Families watched over them closely, offering broths and blankets, whispering prayers in the dim light. Death, when it came, was handled with solemn familiarity. Frozen ground made burial difficult. Sometimes bodies were kept in cold storage until the earth softened. Communities supported one another in small, practical ways, sharing labor, food, and warmth. Yet even in hardship, there was continuity. Children were born. Skills were taught. Stories were remembered. Winter did not stop life. It simply slowed it, forcing it inward. Outside, the natural world rested. Birdsong faded. Insects vanished. Forests stood bare and quiet. Snow muffled sound so completely that even distant movements seemed close, intimate. A single footstep could echo in the mind long after it passed. People learned to listen. They listened to the wind, judging weather. A storm was coming. They listened to animals, noticing changes in behavior. They listened to the fire, knowing when it needed feeding, when it could be left alone. This attentiveness was survival. As weeks passed, the body adapted in small ways. Movements became economical. Breath slowed. Expectations adjusted. Winter was no longer something to fight, but something to live within. And so medieval people waited. They waited for longer days. They waited for the sun to climb higher. They waited for the faint promise of thaw, not with impatience, but with acceptance. Because winter had always come before, and somehow it had always passed. The fire continued to glow softly. Snow continued to fall, and life, quiet and persistent, carried on. The winter deepened further, and the landscape beyond the village grew more distant, softened by drifting snow and heavy mist. Branches of trees bowed under the weight of ice crystals, glimmering faintly in the dim, low winter light. Even rivers slowed their courses, half frozen, their surfaces breaking with occasional thin cracks that made soft, eerie sounds when the ice shifted. The natural world itself seemed to move in whispers, and those whispers became part of daily life, guiding rhythms and routines. People adapted to these hushed patterns. Every morning began with careful attention to the small things. Water had to be drawn from wells before the surface froze solid. Buckets often held ice along with water, and hands, chapped and red from the cold, were wrapped around them for warmth. Even simple tasks like kindling a fire became ceremonies of patience, choosing the driest wood, striking flint carefully, coaxing the first sparks until the flame took hold and began its steady, reassuring glow. In homes, light and warmth were treasured above all else. Candles were slow burning, flickering softly in tiny windows carved into thick walls. The glow illuminated the texture of wooden beams and the rough plaster of walls, highlighting knots in timber, faint scratches from past generations, and the occasional drawing a child had made with soot or charcoal. These quiet details became companions to those inside, reminders of continuity and human presence across time. Meals, though simple, carried their own kind of comfort. Thick porridges bubbled in clay pots, spiced faintly with herbs stored from summer gardens. Bread, coarse and dense, provided a familiar texture and taste. A slice might be buttered lightly if dairy was still available, or spread with a thin layer of honey if the family was fortunate. Even small pleasures were magnified by scarcity. The warmth of broth in chilled hands, the aroma of toasted grains, the satisfying crunch of a crust that had been carefully baked the day before. Daily work shifted to accommodate winter's challenges. Fields lay fallow, but barns demanded attention. Livestock needed hay and grain, water had to be thawed, stalls cleaned. The routine was repetitive, but it was also meditative. The rhythmic motion of carrying feed, sweeping floors, or stacking firewood gave structure to long, gray days. Hands became skilled in quiet labor, repairing tools with patient taps of hammer on metal, mending garments by lamplight, weaving threads into patterns that would endure until the warmer months returned. Clothing was layered with careful thought. Wool, the warmest material widely available, was often patched repeatedly, each repair a sign of care and attention. Capes and cloaks were drawn tightly, mittens bound around hands with string, and hats remained on heads even indoors, preserving precious warmth. Sleeping arrangements were communal, designed to maximize shared heat. Families huddled together under thick blankets, breathing in the warmth of each other and of the slowly fading fire. Nights were long and quiet, broken only by the occasional sound of wind through roof gaps or the low shuffle of animals in nearby stalls. Social life, though constrained, continued in subtle ways. Neighbors shared food when one family had an abundance, a loaf of bread here, a small pot of stew there. Stories were told in soft voices, not for entertainment alone, but as a means of teaching, remembering, and comforting. Children listened with wide eyes to the past, to legends of seasons gone by, to tales of distant lands, absorbing lessons not in words alone but in rhythm, tone, and pause. The threat of illness and malnutrition was never far from mind. Simple colds could worsen into serious fevers, and poor nutrition left bodies vulnerable. Remedies were based on herbs, simple broths, prayers, and observation of natural signs. Those who survived learned to act swiftly, offering warmth, nourishment, and care. Every small act of tending and watching became a thread in the fragile tapestry of survival. Outside, winter continued its quiet dominion. The forest, stripped of its leaves, revealed the skeleton of each tree. Snow muffled sound, creating a profound silence broken only by occasional animal movements or the distant echo of falling ice. Birds, fewer now, flitted from branch to branch, their calls more noticeable against the muted backdrop. The occasional fox or hare left fleeting tracks in the snow, ephemeral marks that would vanish with the next flurry. Observing these signs became part of life, a subtle form of connection with the natural world. Despite these hardships, the season also carried beauty and wonder. Icicles hung from eaves like crystal ornaments. Frost patterns traced delicate lace on windows, intricate designs that fascinated children and adults alike. The light, though pale, created silvered landscapes that seemed almost otherworldly. Even in its austerity, winter held a quiet, almost sacred presence that demanded respect and attentiveness. As weeks slipped by, the rhythm of life remained consistent. Fire, food, work, rest, observation, care, and patience. There was little drama, but much subtle endurance. Each day passed slowly, each moment measured in small, deliberate acts. People adapted to the season's constraints, finding solace in repetition, continuity, and the soft glow of home. The transition into deep winter was gradual, marked by small shifts, water freezing earlier, snow accumulating more steadily, winds that chilled more deeply. Awareness of time became intimate. One could sense the movement of weeks in the thickness of snow, the condition of stored food, the wear of clothing, and the behavior of animals. Life became a series of small, attentive observations, each contributing to survival and comfort. Within homes, quiet creativity flourished. Children practiced simple crafts, weaving, carving, or drawing with soot. Adults repaired, refined, and created tools, clothing, and household items. The boundaries between work, play, and care blurred, forming a gentle continuum of life. Everything done was purposeful yet measured, paced in accordance with the slow passage of the season. Evening brought a deep calm. The fire glowed low, embers providing warmth that softened faces and hands. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling sound, deepening silence. Meals were simple, shared in near darkness, followed by quiet conversation or silent reflection. The mind, slowed by routine and the weight of winter, began to rest even before sleep arrived. And sleep, when it came, was profound. People lay closely together, hearts and breaths mingling, bodies warmed by proximity. The world outside, frozen and still, faded into a soft, white quiet. Dreams were not forced, not dramatic, but gentle, flowing with the rhythm of survival, care, and continuity. Night after night, this became the pattern, steady and enduring. Winter demanded attention, patience, and care, but it also taught endurance, observation, and quiet appreciation of small comforts. It was a season both austere and intimate, shaping the lives of those who lived within it in ways that are easy to overlook when considering history from a distance. As winter slowly wore on, subtle changes began to emerge, almost imperceptible at first. The days grew only slightly longer, the pale sunlight lingering a few minutes more each day over frozen fields. The snow, which had once fallen relentlessly, began to settle in quieter, gentler flurries, leaving the landscape crisp but not unbroken. Even the wind seemed to lose some of its sharpness, curling around walls and roofs with less insistence. Villagers noticed these changes in quiet ways. A thin patch of mud peeking from beneath snow hinted at the ground softening. Animals, restless after months of confinement, moved with a tentative energy, sniffing the air, pawing at snow-covered earth. Livestock grew accustomed to the warmth of stalls and bedding, yet instinct nudged them toward the first hints of spring. Humans, too, felt the subtle lift. Muscles loosened from months of stillness, and hearts seemed to respond to the dim promise of light and renewal. Food, however, remained a central concern. By now, stores were stretched thin. Grain bins were closely monitored, every handful counted and rationed. Root vegetables, slowly shriveling in cellars, became precious. Any remaining salted or smoked meat was carefully portioned. Families learned the quiet art of stretching a meal, combining small amounts of ingredients into thick soups and stews that could nourish multiple people with the bare minimum. Even the simple act of boiling water or stirring a pot took on a meditative rhythm, offering both warmth and purpose in long, monotonous days. Within homes, life continued its steady cadence. Spinning and weaving occupied hands, but also minds, soothing worries with the familiarity of repetitive motion. Small children, too young for sustained labor, learned observation and patience. They watched their elders, absorbing lessons in care and endurance, learning which herbs could ease ailments, how to coax fire from stubborn logs, and when to adjust a blanket to preserve heat. The quiet rhythm of domestic life became its own comfort, a predictable pattern that shaped the very experience of winter. The hearth remained the heart of every home. Flames danced slowly, casting long, soft shadows across walls and wooden beams. The crackle and pop of burning wood became a kind of music, subtle, unhurried, and comforting. Even the occasional smoke that drifted through the room was familiar, like an old friend reminding occupants that life persisted. Many families developed rituals around the fire. Some told stories, passing history and wisdom gently from one generation to the next. Others sang soft songs, their melodies mingling with the low murmur of flames and the muted winds outside. Sleep adapted to the season as well. People often slept in multiple segments during the long nights. The first sleep came soon after the sun set, heavy and deep. Then, a period of wakefulness allowed for quiet reflection, tending animals, or whispering to one another. The second sleep, lighter and slower, followed before dawn. This segmented rhythm matched the stillness of winter, creating a pattern of rest and activity that felt natural, even soothing, to those living within it. Illness and vulnerability persisted, lingering quietly in the background of daily life. The cold sapped strength, and even minor ailments could worsen if not carefully tended. Families relied on both herbal remedies and attentiveness. Leaves, roots, and barks gathered and dried earlier in the year were combined into simple teas and poultices. The knowledge of these remedies passed softly from elder to younger, embedded in the rhythm of everyday care rather than formal instruction. Social life, while muted, offered comfort when possible. Neighbors occasionally visited when roads allowed, carrying small gifts of preserved food or simply sharing company to break the monotony of isolation. Words were spoken quietly, often about practical matters, the weather, the state of barns, or the health of children and animals. Even these mundane exchanges carried warmth, a reminder that the outside world, though distant and challenging, still existed. Outside, nature began to show signs of subtle resilience. Snowdrops pushed faint white heads through layers of frost. Thin green shoots hinted at life beneath the frozen soil. Animals that had seemed lethargic or hidden moved with renewed energy, their small tracks appearing in the softened snow. The forest, stripped bare for months, revealed textures and patterns in bark and branches previously hidden by snow, inviting attention and careful observation. Life remained slow, measured, and deliberate. Every act was small but meaningful, stoking the fire, chopping wood, mending clothing, feeding animals, rationing food. These repeated actions were not burdensome. They became meditative, grounding the mind and body. Time stretched and folded in quiet layers, the days blending seamlessly with nights, forming a long, gentle continuum that asked for patience and rewarded careful attention. By midwinter, anticipation of spring began to shape thoughts, though subtly. It was never a rush or demand, but a quiet awareness. Signs in the landscape and in the behavior of animals informed decisions. Seeds saved for spring were sorted, and plans for planting discussed softly in the warmth of the hearth. Preparation and observation coexisted, each reinforcing the other in a rhythm of survival and gentle hope. Evenings were especially still. After chores were completed, families lingered in the firelight. They spoke in low tones, told stories of distant lands or remembered ancestors, and allowed silence to settle comfortably. The quiet hours between work and sleep became a sacred space, a time when thoughts could wander without pressure, when the mind could slow, and the body could absorb warmth. In these moments, winter revealed itself, not only as a season of survival, but as a container for reflection, patience, and gentle continuity. And always, the fire remained at the center. Flames flickered, embers glowed, and the room hummed with a quiet life all its own. The cold, vast world outside contrasted with this intimate warmth, emphasizing the small, tender acts that sustained life in winter. Every meal, every stitch of fabric, every small conversation contributed to the persistent, unbroken thread of survival. The long nights softened gradually. Shadows became less heavy. Light lingered longer on walls and floors. The world outside, still frosted and quiet, seemed less distant, less foreboding. Even in its austerity, winter revealed a subtle beauty. The shimmer of snow in pale sunlight, the crisp patterns of frost on glass, the gentle, persistent rhythm of life continuing quietly despite hardship. And so, in the hush of midwinter, life moved forward in quiet steps, guided by attention, patience, and the soft, enduring glow of firelight. As the deepest part of winter gradually gave way to its final weeks, subtle shifts in the world began to signal that change was near. The days lengthened imperceptibly, the sun climbing a little higher each morning, its pale light stretching longer across frozen fields and snow-laden rooftops. Even in the gray mid-mornings, a faint warmth could sometimes be felt on exposed skin, a quiet promise of the season to come. Villagers noticed these small shifts with attentive eyes. Tiny buds, long hidden beneath frozen soil or snow, hinted at life beneath the winter hush. Early snowdrops and crocuses, delicate and shy, pushed their heads upward, white and pale green against the soft frost. Animals, too, seemed to sense the subtle change. Livestock moved with slightly more ease. Birds returned in trickles, and even the foxes and hares that had been cautious during the bitterest months became bolder in their movements. Life inside the home adjusted with these subtle signs. Work continued, steady and quiet, but there was a sense of anticipation woven through the routine. Grain stores were carefully measured, Root vegetables and preserved foods were slowly consumed, and preparation for the coming planting season began. Small tasks were completed with deliberate attention. Mending garments became more urgent as lighter spring clothing would soon be needed. Tools were cleaned and sharpened. Seeds were sorted and stored, ready to be planted when the thaw came. Evenings remained long, yet the shift in daylight had a gentle, calming effect on the rhythm of the household. The fire continued to glow in hearths, a warm companion against the chill, but its role began to change slightly. No longer solely a barrier against piercing cold, it became a source of comfort for longer conversations and quiet reflection. Families lingered around the hearth, telling stories, recalling past seasons, and imagining the warmth and activity of spring. The flickering light painted faces and walls, casting gentle shadows that seemed to move in time with the soft, quiet heartbeat of the room. Children, too, noticed the subtle promise of change. They watched for the first signs of green in the snow, listened for the faint calls of returning birds, and learned the gentle rhythms of nature by observation. Even in their play, they mirrored the quiet patience of adults, small, careful gestures, soft laughter, and deliberate attention to the world around them. Winter's hardships, though still present, felt slightly less oppressive. Food was still rationed, though the worst scarcity had passed. Cold, while still a companion, became more manageable. Clothing remained layered and practical, but the weight of constant vigilance began to lighten. Hands, once stiff and chapped, began to regain a measure of comfort. Feet, warmed by repeated care and careful placement near embers, moved with less hesitance. The community remained intertwined, bound together by share effort and quiet awareness. Neighbors offered help when needed, whether delivering small portions of food, aiding with barn work, or offering companionship in the still evenings. Social life, though never extravagant, began to take on a gentle vibrancy. Quiet gatherings around the hearth of a larger home or in a small chapel allowed for the soft renewal of human connection. Words were still measured, voices soft, but the presence of others brought warmth that no fire alone could provide. Outside, nature continued its subtle transformation. Snow became less oppressive, melting in thin sheets under the weak sun. Streams freed themselves from ice in slow, deliberate flows. Trees, though still bare, revealed their underlying structure and strength. Birds returned in larger numbers, their soft songs breaking the long silence of winter forests. Even the wind seemed to lose some of its edge, rustling softly through branches rather than cutting sharply against walls and clothing. As the season approached its final stretch, daily routines maintained their steady rhythm but were imbued with a quiet optimism. Tasks were completed with care, but also with the awareness that the world would soon change. Children practiced skills learned during months of stillness, preparing for outdoor activities and the tasks of planting. Adults planned, organized, and anticipated, using the wisdom of previous years to guide their actions. Nightfall remained long and still, but the perception of time had shifted. Darkness was less absolute. The faint glimmer of extended twilight offered comfort. The hearth continued its soft glow, and the household gathered around it in the familiar, intimate pattern. Stories were told, sometimes of the harshness of the past months, sometimes of dreams for the warmth of spring, and sometimes simply of nothing at all, letting the mind drift slowly, freely, like a snowflake on the wind. Sleep, too, became gentler in these final weeks. The body, having endured months of cold and close quarters, now rested more easily. Segmented sleep, once dictated by the harshest nights, began to merge more fully into a single, deeper rest. Breathing slowed, muscles relaxed, minds, attuned to long patterns of quiet observation and care, drifted without struggle. Through it all, the quiet lessons of winter remained. Patience, attentiveness, care, and endurance had carried families through the season. Small acts of tending the fire, mending clothing, feeding animals, sharing food, and observing nature had all contributed to survival and comfort. And in those simple, repeated acts, life itself revealed its steady, enduring rhythm, a rhythm as old as time, quiet and unhurried, yet profoundly sustaining. And as the first faint hints of spring began to color the edges of the snow, the world outside the village softened. The landscape, once frozen and stark, began to promise renewal. The rhythm of life, though never frantic, seemed to pulse with quiet anticipation. The hearth still glowed, food was still shared, stories were still told, and the long, measured nights gently led the household toward the warmer, lighter days ahead. Spring approached gradually, barely noticeable at first, but with changes that were felt keenly by those who had endured the long winter. The snow began to thin, leaving behind patches of exposed earth, dark and rich beneath the frost. Icicles shrank and dripped steadily in the weak sunlight, their gentle falling creating soft, almost musical sounds against stone and wood. Streams, once half frozen, ran more freely now, their water clear and cold, carrying a subtle freshness that spoke of renewal. Villagers welcomed these shifts with a quiet, restrained optimism. There was no sudden excitement, no rushing about, but a soft, shared awareness that the long season of cold and stillness was giving way to movement, growth, and possibility. Children ran more freely outside, their boots crunching on thawing ground, their breaths steaming in the lingering cold air. Laughter, light and unhurried, began to echo softly through the village lanes. Inside homes, life retained the calm, deliberate rhythm of winter, but it carried new undertones. Tasks previously restricted to the indoors began to move outdoors again. People checked fences, inspected roofs, and repaired tools in preparation for planting. Barns were cleaned more thoroughly now that cold winds were less persistent, and hay and straw were refreshed to ensure warmth for the remaining cold nights. The anticipation of spring work shaped even the smallest daily acts, giving them purpose without haste. Meals began to shift subtly as well. Preserved foods were still used carefully, but small signs of freshness emerged. The first green shoots of herbs gathered before the frost provided flavor. Early greens from sheltered gardens or south-facing walls added color and variety to dishes. Even these small additions were treasured, a gentle reminder that winter's austerity was loosening its grip. The hearth, still central to household life, adapted to the changing season. Flames were tended with care, but they were no longer relied upon solely for survival. The fire became a companion rather than a necessity, its warmth comforting rather than imperative. Families lingered around it in the evenings, speaking softly of memories from the long winter, recounting moments of endurance, sharing gentle humor, and reflecting on the slow passage of time. Sleep, too, began to follow the changing light. Nights, though still long compared to summer, no longer felt oppressive. The body, gradually adjusted to more daylight and slightly warmer temperatures, rested more easily. The rhythm of segmented sleep softened into longer stretches. Dreams carried hints of open air, green fields, and early blooms, a subconscious recognition of the shift in seasons. Outside, the natural world responded slowly but unmistakably. Birds returned in increasing numbers, their songs growing in strength and complexity. Hares and foxes ventured further from the forest edges, and the forest itself revealed subtle colors as mosses and early sprouts pushed through the thinning snow. The wind, once sharp and penetrating, now rustled softly, carrying hints of damp earth and new growth. Even the sky seemed lighter, more open, stretching in pale blues and soft grays that promised longer, warmer days. Community life followed the same gentle transition. The long isolation imposed by winter loosened its hold. Neighbors visited more freely, exchanging news and sharing tasks. Villages began to feel connected again as travel became easier. The soft bonds of shared endurance in the harsh months carried forward into cooperative preparations for spring. Clearing paths, repairing barns and fences, sharing seeds, and planning for planting. The pace remained slow, reflective, yet filled with quiet purpose. Everyday life retained its intimate details, the small acts that had sustained people through winter. Spinning, weaving, mending, and cooking continued, but now alongside outdoor work. Observing the world, noting early signs of growth, tending animals, and caring for the vulnerable, all continued as they always had, but the energy carried a subtle lightness. The knowledge that the harshest trials had passed made each act feel steady and reassuring. Children's play reflected the gradual return of freedom. They chased each other in thawing fields, observed early birds' nests, and explored the edges of the forest where snow still lingered. Discoveries, whether a sprouting leaf or the soft tracks of a fox, were absorbed quietly, teaching observation, patience, and the subtle rhythms of life. These lessons, learned gently and without urgency, were as vital as the survival skills practiced during winter. As the days lengthened, people began preparing for discoveries, whether a sprouting leaf or the soft tracks of a fox, were absorbed quietly, teaching observation, patience, and the subtle rhythms of life. These lessons, learned gently and without urgency, were as vital as the survival skills practiced during winter. As the days lengthened, people began preparing for planting. Seeds that had been carefully stored were sorted, soil was readied where the frost had loosened, and tools sharpened and cleaned. Every small preparation was done with patience and attention, mindful of the delicate balance of warmth, soil moisture, and the return of the sun. It was a slow, deliberate process, blending anticipation with careful observation. Evening routines maintained their comforting cadence. The fire remained a soft glow, meals were shared, and stories were told in the same gentle, unhurried rhythm. Yet the tone was subtly different. There was a sense of expectation, of life moving toward expansion, growth, and warmth. Nights felt quieter, softer, and more forgiving. Sleep arrived with ease, cradled by familiarity, warmth, and the slow hum of returning life outside. The final weeks of winter were a delicate bridge between endurance and renewal. The hardships that had defined the season receded gradually, leaving behind only lessons, memories, and the quiet strength of those who had endured. The landscape, still partly covered in snow, hinted at what was coming: green shoots, flowing streams, returning birds, and the promise of warmth. And so, in this gentle transition, medieval people moved from survival to subtle celebration, from restraint to gentle hope, from the hush of deep winter to the soft awakening of spring. Life continued in its quiet, deliberate rhythm, shaped by seasons, observation, and the tender care of countless small, enduring acts. As spring unfolded more fully, the world outside the village began to awaken in small, deliberate movements. Snow receded gradually, revealing dark, rich soil, still moist from winter thaw. Patches of green pushed upward tentatively, timid shoots of early herbs, clovers, and tiny wildflowers threading their way through lingering frost. The air smelled of wet earth and the faint, sweet tang of new growth, carrying a freshness that seemed to seep into bones stiffened by winter's cold. Villagers greeted these subtle changes with quiet, mindful attention. Their work shifted in gentle stages. Where winter had confined them mostly indoors, now hands moved outdoors, tending soil, repairing fences, and preparing barns for new animals or spring births. There was no rush, no clamor for speed. Each act was measured, deliberate, an extension of the care that had sustained life through the colder months. The hearth, though still central, began to take on a slightly different role. Fire was no longer only a shield against frost, but a companion for longer evenings, a source of comfort as daylight expanded. Flames danced in familiar patterns, their light reflecting in wooden beams and plastered walls. The smell of burning wood mingled with the scent of damp earth coming through slightly ajar doors and windows, blending the indoors and outdoors into a seamless, lived experience. Meals began to change as the season allowed. Root vegetables from winter stores were supplemented with early greens and herbs. The first sprouts of fresh onions, leeks, or leafy greens were treasured, adding color, aroma, and subtle taste to broths and stews. Every bite carried the quiet satisfaction of survival, a gentle reward for months of careful rationing and patient endurance. Work in the fields was slow and steady. People tested soil with hands and tools, gauging moisture and texture. Small furrows were turned, seed drills readied, and early planting began where frost had lifted. Each movement was deliberate. The rhythm of labor followed a quiet cadence, mirroring the soft heartbeat of the village itself. Children often assisted in minor ways, carrying small bundles, scattering seeds under watchful guidance, or observing, learning, and absorbing the ways of the land. Outside, animals adjusted naturally to the subtle warmth. Birds became more vocal, their soft calls threading through the village streets and fields. Cattle, goats, and sheep ventured further from stalls, eager to nibble on the first patches of tender grass. Hares and foxes moved lightly over softened earth, leaving delicate tracks that told of cautious exploration. Even the forest, previously bare and stark, now showed textures and muted greens hinting at the complex life stirring within. Community rhythms subtly changed as well. Neighbors could travel more easily, carrying seeds, tools, or simply visiting for companionship. Small acts of assistance, sharing knowledge about soil conditions, lending a tool, or offering a portion of early greens, created bonds strengthened through winter's quiet endurance. Life, once contained within homes and barns, began to flow more freely, guided by shared observation, care, and experience. The long nights, though gradually shortening, continued to hold a gentle, reflective quality. Even as daylight extended, evenings retained a softness, a lingering hush. Around the fire, conversations turned to plans for the coming season. Discussions of planting, garden layouts, and livestock care mixed with stories and gentle humor. Children listened, absorbing practical lessons, history, and quiet wisdom, their minds attuned to the subtleties of survival and the slow rhythm of daily life. Sleep remained a treasured necessity. Nights, longer than summer but shorter than deep winter, allowed for more restful stretches. The body, freed from the harshness of frost and scarcity, relaxed further. Dreams began to carry images of open fields, flowing water, and green shoots, reflecting the subtle stirrings of life outside. The mind, conditioned by months of careful observation and quiet labor, drifted easily into rest, cradled by familiarity and the soft sounds of life within the home. Spring cleaning, in its simplest form, began as well. Spaces used intensively during winter were swept, washed, and aired when possible. Bedding was refreshed. Tools were sharpened and organized. Clothing, patched and layered for winter endurance, was examined for repairs or replacement. These small acts were practical but also meditative, a quiet ritual of preparation for a new phase of life. Nature itself became a teacher during these early weeks. Villagers watched the behavior of animals, noting when cows and goats sought fresh grazing, how birds began to nest, and how soil warmed under early sun. The first insects emerged slowly, signaling the return of more complex life cycles. Observation of these subtle shifts informed decisions, guided labor, and allowed people to live in harmony with the changing rhythms of the world. Even chores retained their meditative quality. Carrying water, feeding animals, tending early seedlings, mending tools or garments. All were performed with care and attention. Each motion was quiet, deliberate, and imbued with the understanding that survival and comfort were built in these small, repeated acts. By mid-spring, the landscape was transformed. Where once snow and frost had dominated, fields began to glow with soft greens, interspersed with early blooms. Streams ran freely and clearly. Forests showed the faint, muted palette of budding leaves and moss. The village itself appeared lighter and more open, not just in appearance but in the atmosphere of life. Movement, activity, and quiet conversation became easier, freer, and subtly joyful. Through it all, the lessons of winter remained. Patience, observation, careful attention to resources, and the quiet endurance of repetitive, purposeful acts had guided families through months of stillness and challenge. These habits, cultivated during the hush of cold months, now supported renewed activity, allowing life to unfold gently and deliberately, in harmony with the slow cycles of nature. As spring deepened, the village gradually transformed under the slow, steady touch of warmer days and softening winds. Morning light, once weak and fleeting, lingered a little longer each day, spilling over rooftops and illuminating the textures of timber, plaster, and stone. Roof tiles glimmered with residual frost melted by early sunlight, and paths that had been slippery or buried under snow became more defined, revealing the soft, dark earth beneath. Villagers began to move with a gentler ease. Tasks that had been constrained by winter's bite could now be performed outdoors without the same urgency or caution. Children followed adults more confidently into fields and orchards, exploring, learning, and participating in small ways. Every step was deliberate, measured, and attentive to the softened earth beneath boots and the occasional puddle from melting snow. The first signs of plant life were everywhere. Crocuses opened delicate petals, snowdrops stood in tiny clusters, and the first hints of grass emerged through the thawed ground. Even moss, which had lain dormant under frost, glowed faintly green in shaded areas. People watched closely, noting which seeds had survived winter storage, which sprouts would thrive, and which patches of soil were ready for planting. Observation remained a quiet, ongoing practice, one cultivated deeply through months of careful attention during the long winter. Hearths, while still warm and comforting, became companions rather than necessities. Flames were tended for light and ritual rather than survival, and smoke, once a protective barrier against cold, now mingled lightly with fresh air drifting in through open doors and windows. Evenings were soft, filled with gentle conversation, shared meals, and quiet reflection. Stories continued, passed from elders to young ones, blending memory, guidance, and gentle humor. Meals shifted as the season allowed. Preserved foods from winter stores were supplemented with early garden herbs, tender greens, and the occasional fresh eggs from returning hens. Bread remained dense and hearty, but its flavor was enhanced by the first touches of new ingredients. Small celebrations of taste and freshness were subtle, quiet acknowledgments of endurance and continuity rather than overt festivity. Outdoors, the village itself came alive in subtle movements. Livestock, no longer confined by snow and ice, roamed more freely within fenced areas. Chickens scratched eagerly in softened earth, pecking at worms and seeds newly exposed. Birds returned in greater numbers, filling the air with soft calls and quiet songs. Hares and foxes, more confident in the lighter, less frozen landscape, moved gracefully through open fields and forest edges. Nature, while gentle and slow, was undeniably active, its rhythms teaching patience, observation, and subtle adaptation. Community interactions increased gently. Paths that had been impassable during winter now allowed neighbors to visit one another with ease. Tools and supplies were shared quietly, early planting plans discussed, and small acts of assistance performed without ceremony. The village, which had seemed contained and isolated during winter, slowly began to expand outward into shared spaces, guided by the unhurried rhythms of early spring. The long evenings retained their reflective quality. Though daylight stretched longer, shadows remained soft, and the fire continued to provide a warm glow. Families gathered, observing the world outside through open windows or doors, sharing news and quiet thoughts, or simply sitting in companionable silence. The rhythm of life, work, observation, reflection, and rest, continued to flow gently, each segment of the day blending into the next without urgency. Children's play echoed the subtle return of energy. They explored fields and woods, noticed the tracks of returning animals, and watched the slow unfolding of plant life. Their lessons in observation, patience, and quiet care, cultivated during the long winter, now found expression in movement, exploration, and gentle curiosity. Adults guided these explorations with soft words and careful supervision, ensuring safety while allowing freedom and growth. Preparations for the planting season continued steadily. Seeds stored from winter were sorted and organized, soil was turned carefully, and the first gentle sowing began where the frost had lifted. Tools were maintained, sharpened, and adjusted. Each movement was deliberate, mindful of the fragile balance between soil, moisture, and the emerging warmth of sun and air. The rhythm of labor blended seamlessly with observation, reflection, and gentle anticipation. Evening sleep remained restful and deep, buoyed by the gradual return of warmth and the faint sounds of life outside. The body, conditioned by months of endurance, rested easily. The mind, accustomed to careful attention and quiet reflection, drifted gently, absorbing the soft rhythms of the surrounding world. Dreams carried the images of sprouting seeds, flowing water, returning birds, and early green shoots, a subconscious reflection of the gentle awakening beyond the walls of home. Through these weeks, the lessons of winter persisted quietly. Endurance, careful attention, patience, observation, and small acts of tending continued to shape daily life. The skills cultivated during the cold months, rationing, observing, repairing, caring, formed the foundation for spring, allowing life to expand gently, deliberately, and with quiet resilience. By mid-spring, the village had transformed from the muted stillness of winter into a world quietly brimming with life. The snow had vanished entirely from fields and lanes, leaving dark, fertile soil that glistened after soft rains. Early shoots had matured into small clusters of green, and the first wildflowers added gentle touches of color to the edges of paths and in meadows. Trees, bare for months, now revealed subtle buds along their branches, promising leaves and shade in the weeks to come. Villagers adapted to the increased activity of the season with measured, attentive movements. Daily work became more varied. Fields were plowed with care, and early seeds were sown into furrows that had been softened by thawing soil. Small irrigation channels were tested, repaired, and gently guided to nourish the emerging crops. Livestock was guided to fresh pasture, and attention was given to those animals birthing young, ensuring warmth and safety in early spring chill. Each act, though simple, was deliberate and attentive, reflecting the quiet patience that winter had nurtured. Inside homes, life remained centered on the hearth, though the fire now served mostly for cooking and comfort rather than survival. Flames cast soft flickers on walls and beams, illuminating the worn textures of wood, the faint carvings of previous generations, and the occasional small drawing of a child or a previous resident. The smell of burning wood mixed with the aroma of early greens, bread baking, and stews simmering over gentle heat, filling rooms with familiar and soothing scents. Meals reflected both continuity and subtle change. Preserved foods were still used carefully, but fresh ingredients added new depth. Tender shoots of herbs, early greens, and occasional eggs or milk from returning livestock became valued additions. Each meal was a quiet celebration of endurance and renewal, simple yet satisfying, with textures and flavors that reminded villagers of both survival and the emerging promise of spring. Children moved more freely now, running through the softened fields, exploring forest edges, and learning the subtleties of the natural world. They observed birds returning to nests, the slow unfurling of leaves, and the cautious emergence of insects. Their play was gentle and attentive, blending curiosity with patience. Every small discovery was a lesson, reinforcing skills learned during the long months of winter: observation, careful attention, and quiet reflection. The village itself felt lighter. Paths, once frozen and treacherous, were easily traversed. Neighbors visited more freely, carrying small tools, seeds, or portions of early harvest. Quiet exchanges became more frequent, and the communal aspect of life, strengthened by months of shared endurance, was now expressed in practical cooperation, gentle conversation, and shared observation. Even small gestures, like lending a hand to repair a fence or passing along a sprouted seedling, became quietly meaningful threads in the fabric of community. Outside, nature moved with measured energy. Birds sang with increasing confidence. Insects became more noticeable, and the forest revealed layers of green. Streams ran freely and clearly, reflecting the pale spring sky. Animals, freed from the limitations of winter, moved gracefully, leaving soft tracks in the damp soil. Observing these changes remained vital. Villagers interpreted subtle shifts in animal behavior, soil texture, and weather as guides for planting, tending crops, and managing livestock. Evenings retained a gentle, reflective rhythm. Families gathered near the hearth, speaking softly of tasks completed and those to come. Stories, lessons, and quiet humor were shared, fostering both continuity and connection. The soft, lingering light from the longer days seeped into windows, blending with the glow of firelight to create a warm, intimate atmosphere. Reflection, observation, and storytelling formed a seamless cycle with work and rest, maintaining the quiet balance that had defined life through winter. Sleep was deep, restorative, and accompanied by the subtle sounds of awakening nature outside. The rhythmic breathing of family members, the occasional distant call of a returning bird, and the soft murmur of water in nearby streams provided a soothing soundtrack. Dreams, gently influenced by the shift in season, carried images of sprouting crops, flowing water, and soft sunlight filtering through trees. images that mirrored the slow, deliberate expansion of life outside the home. Tasks continued steadily, but with a gentle sense of anticipation. Tools were maintained and organized, soil was carefully tended, and early planting progressed. Water channels and simple irrigation systems were adjusted as needed, guided by careful observation of moisture, sun exposure, and soil condition. Every act was small but essential, performed with patience, attention, and awareness of the intricate balance between human effort and natural rhythms. Through these weeks of early spring, the lessons of winter continued to guide daily life. Patience, careful observation, enduring attention to detail, and the small acts of tending, mending, and caring remained central. Yet these same lessons now enabled growth, renewal, and gentle optimism. The knowledge that the harshest months had passed, combined with attentiveness to emerging patterns of life, allowed the village to expand its activity without haste. In harmony with the gradual unfolding of the season, as spring settled more confidently into the land, warmth became a steady presence rather than a fleeting visitor. The sun rose earlier now, its light spilling gently across fields and rooftops, touching everything with a softness that felt earned after the long endurance of winter. Mornings carried a mild chill, but it no longer bit into skin or stiffened fingers. Instead, it lingered briefly, then faded as the day unfolded. Villagers woke to a world that felt wider. Doors were opened more often, windows unlatched to let fresh air move through homes that had been closed tightly for months. The scent of damp earth, budding leaves, and distant wood smoke drifted inside, blending with the familiar smells of hearth and food. The indoors and outdoors were no longer separate realms, but parts of the same living space, flowing gently into one another. Work in the fields became more consistent and absorbing. Seeds planted earlier began to show their first true leaves, delicate but resilient, pushing steadily upward. People moved through rows with careful steps, inspecting growth, adjusting soil, and protecting young plants from lingering cold nights. Cloaks were lighter now, sleeves pushed back more often, hands working directly with the earth, feeling its temperature, its moisture, its readiness. Animals responded fully to the change. Sheep and goats grazed contentedly, their movements relaxed and unhurried. Cows were led to pasture each morning, their hooves pressing soft impressions into the ground. Chickens wandered freely, scratching and clucking, their presence adding gentle sound to the village. The constant closeness to animals, so intense during winter, now felt more balanced, spread out under open skies. Inside the home, daily routines adjusted without disruption. Meals were still simple, still grounded in the careful use of stores, but fresh elements appeared more frequently. Young greens were added to stews. Milk became more plentiful. Eggs were gathered regularly. Each meal carried a quiet sense of gratitude, not spoken aloud, but felt deeply in the steady hands that prepared food and the calm attention of those who ate together. Children spent more time outdoors, their energy unfolding naturally with the season. They followed adults into fields, asked quiet questions, and learned by watching. They learned how to recognize healthy plants, how to move carefully among seedlings, how to notice changes in weather and soil. These lessons were not formal, not spoken as instruction, but absorbed slowly, carried forward as lived knowledge. The village itself seemed to breathe more easily. Paths were dry and firm. Travel between nearby settlements became routine again. Small groups walked together along familiar routes, carrying baskets, tools, or messages. Encounters felt gentle and unhurried, marked by nods, brief conversations, and shared understanding. Life expanded outward, but without noise or urgency. Evenings remained a treasured time. Though daylight lingered longer, people still gathered near the hearth as the sun dipped low. The fire burned smaller now, more for comfort than necessity, its light softer against walls warmed by the day. Conversations unfolded slowly, sometimes filled with words, sometimes resting comfortably in silence. The sounds of evening drifted in from outside, birds settling, animals quieting, distant footsteps along village paths. Stories continued, but their tone shifted subtly. Where winter tales often centered on memory and endurance, spring stories carried hints of anticipation. Plans were spoken gently. Hopes were shared without excitement, just calm expectation. There was confidence now, grounded in the knowledge that winter had been survived, that life had persisted. Sleep came easily. Bodies, no longer strained by cold and scarcity, rested deeply. Windows were sometimes left slightly open, letting in cool night air and the soft sounds of the living world. Dreams flowed quietly, shaped by days spent outdoors, hands in soil, eyes lifted to sky and fields. Nature continued its steady unfolding. Trees leafed out gradually, each branch filling in with green. Wildflowers spread along field edges and forest paths. Insects returned in small numbers, their presence subtle but essential. Rain fell, gently at times, soaking the ground without flooding it, welcomed rather than feared. Observation remained constant. Villagers watched the sky, the behavior of animals, the condition of crops. This attentiveness, refined through winter's demands, now guided decisions with ease. When to plant more, when to wait, when to protect young growth from late frost. Nothing was rushed. Everything followed rhythm. The memory of winter lingered, not as fear, but as knowledge. People remembered the cold floors, the thin meals, the long nights. That memory shaped how they moved through spring, not with excess, but with care. Resources were still respected. Food was not wasted. Firewood was stacked again, already thinking ahead, even as warmth returned. This quiet balance defined medieval life. Survival was never separate from living. Each season flowed into the next, carrying lessons forward. Winter taught patience and endurance. Spring offered renewal and steady purpose. And so the village moved onward, not marking time with dates or declarations, but with growth, light, and the gentle certainty that life, when tended carefully, continued. The days lengthened, the earth warmed, and the rhythm of life settled into a calm, steady pace once more. As the season continued to open itself, spring became fully present in every corner of village life. The air felt softer now, carrying warmth that lingered through the day instead of retreating at dawn. Sunlight filtered through new leaves, casting shifting patterns on the ground, on walls, on the quiet paths people walked each morning. These patterns moved slowly, almost lazily, reminding everyone that time no longer needed to be guarded so closely. The earth responded generously. Fields darkened and loosened beneath careful hands. Seedlings strengthened, their stems less fragile, their leaves turning outward to meet the sun. People moved among them with practiced care, stepping lightly, bending often, touching soil as if greeting an old companion. Farming was never rushed. It followed the land's pace, guided by observation rather than urgency. Clothing changed subtly. Heavy cloaks were set aside more often, replaced with lighter layers still worn from habit as much as need. Wool remained close at hand, but sleeves were rolled back, collars loosened. Skin met air freely again, feeling warmth that had been absent for many months. The body remembered this feeling slowly, easing into it with the same patience that had carried it through winter. Inside the home, the rhythm softened further. Doors stayed open during the day, letting sounds drift in, the lowing of cattle, distant voices, the call of birds. The hearth was still used, still tended, but its dominance faded gently. Smoke rose less often. Meals were cooked earlier in the day, sometimes outside when weather allowed. The house no longer felt like a shelter under siege, but a resting place between moments of work and observation. Food reflected this gentle abundance. Fresh greens appeared more often in bowls and pots. Milk was shared more freely. Bread remained simple, but its presence was reassuring rather than carefully measured. People ate slowly, without ceremony, grateful not in words but in the calm. Deeper into homes, touching walls that had been dim for months. Shadows shifted slowly across floors, marking time in a way no clock ever could. People rose with a sense of ease, bodies no longer bracing themselves against cold. The day felt open, full of possibility without expectation. Work carried a natural flow. Fields were tended steadily, not from pressure but from understanding. Crops needed attention, not haste. Each plant was given space. Each row walked carefully. Hands brushed leaves, tested soil, straightened stems bent by wind or rain. These small gestures, repeated day after day, created a quiet bond between people and land. Animals moved with confidence now. They grazed without hesitation, their routines settled and predictable. New life appeared among them. Small lambs, calves, chicks, fragile but strong, watched closely and cared for with gentle hands. Their presence was reassuring, a sign that the cycle of seasons was continuing as it always had. Inside the home, daily tasks remained simple. Cloth was spun and woven in calmer moments. Clothing was repaired not out of urgency, but habit. Tools were kept clean and ready, their weight familiar in the hand. The home felt lighter, more spacious, as if winter's closeness had loosened its hold. Food continued to reflect balance. Meals were filling but unadorned. Fresh greens were now common enough to feel normal. Milk, bread, and simple stews sustained without worry. People ate slowly, seated comfortably, sometimes outdoors, sometimes near open doors. Hunger no longer guided every thought. Children learned constantly. They followed adults through fields and along paths, listening more than speaking. They learned which clouds meant rain, which birds stayed close to nests, which plants thrived in sun or shade. Knowledge was absorbed quietly, through presence and repetition, just as it had been for generations. The village felt steady, not busy, not quiet, just alive. People crossed paths naturally, exchanged brief words, shared small efforts. No one stood apart. Community existed not through events, but through shared rhythms and mutual awareness. Evenings stretched long and gentle. The light lingered well past the end of work. People paused often, letting their eyes rest on the land. These pauses felt earned, not stolen. The world seemed to encourage stillness. When the hearth was lit, it was done without urgency. Its warmth was subtle, its glow comforting. It framed conversation rather than commanding it. Sometimes the fire crackled softly while voices drifted. Sometimes it burned in silence, its presence enough. Sleep came softly each night. Bodies rested deeply, accustomed now to movement and warmth. The mind, no longer alert for danger or scarcity, loosened its grip on thought. Night sounds filtered in, wind through leaves, distant animals, the quiet settling of the village. Nature continued its quiet lessons. Growth did not rush. Rain came gently. Plants responded patiently. Nothing forced its way forward. Everything waited for the right moment. And within this calm unfolding, the memory of winter remained. Not as fear, not as weight, but as wisdom. It lived in habits, saving, repairing, observing. It lived in gratitude felt rather than spoken. It lived in the deep understanding that comfort was temporary and therefore precious. This understanding shaped life gently. People did not waste warmth. They did not ignore abundance. They did not forget stillness. They lived within the rhythm of seasons, accepting each as it came. As the weeks passed, spring settled fully into its place, no longer tentative, no longer cautious. The land had warmed enough that walking barefoot on sunlit patches of earth no longer shocked the skin. Grass thickened beneath feet. Leaves unfurled completely, filling trees with soft motion and shade that shifted gently with the breeze. Life moved in steady circles now. Each morning felt familiar in the best way. Light arrived gradually, filtering through leaves and wooden shutters, waking the house without urgency. People stirred slowly, stretching, listening to the quiet sounds outside before rising. There was no sudden call to action. The day waited patiently. Work followed the rhythm of daylight. Fields were no longer fragile. Seedlings had strengthened into young plants that could withstand careful tending. People moved among them confidently, adjusting soil, guiding growth, protecting where needed. Hands knew what to do without thought. Bodies moved efficiently, conserving energy, working with the land rather than against it. Animals settled into their routines completely. Pastures filled with calm movement. Livestock grazed steadily, their presence soothing and predictable. Newborn animals grew stronger each day, watched closely but without fear. Their soft sounds blended with birdsong, wind, and distant voices, creating a quiet, living soundscape that carried through the village. Inside homes, space felt different. Winter's closeness had eased. Rooms felt larger. Air moved freely. Light touched corners that had been dim for months. The home became a place of pause rather than protection, a place to return to between moments of activity. Meals were no longer measured with concern. Food was still simple, still prepared with care, but worry no longer hovered. Fresh ingredients appeared regularly. The body felt nourished rather than merely sustained. People ate slowly, without distraction, often in shared silence that felt comfortable and complete. Children grew more independent. They explored familiar places with confidence, returning home with stories told quietly, without excitement. They learned boundaries through experience, where the ground stayed damp, where insects gathered, where shade lingered longest. Their understanding deepened not through explanation, but through living within the world around them. The village held a gentle hum. Not noise, but presence. Movement without pressure. Purpose without strain. People passed one another often, exchanging nods, brief words, shared understanding. No one needed to announce what they were doing. Everyone already knew. Evenings remained soft and expansive. Light lingered long enough that the end of the day arrived gradually. Shadows stretched slowly. The air cooled gently rather than sharply. People worked until it felt right to stop, then stopped without regret. The hearth still glowed in the evenings. Its flame was small, steady, familiar. It no longer marked survival, but continuity. People gathered around it not because they needed to, but because it felt right to do so. Conversation wandered gently. Sometimes it touched on plans, harvests, repairs, weather. Sometimes it drifted into memory. Often it faded entirely, replaced by the quiet comfort of shared presence. Sleep came naturally. The body rested deeply, accustomed to steady movement and warmth. Windows remained open, curtains shifting softly with night air. Sounds from outside flowed in gently, leaves moving, animals settling, the distant hush of the world at rest. Dreams were calm, if noticed at all. They carried no urgency, just impressions, light, movement, familiar paths. The mind no longer held tightly to worry. It drifted easily, confident in the steadiness of life. Nature continued its quiet unfolding. Nothing hurried. Nothing stalled. Growth followed its own pace, responding to sun, rain, and soil. The balance felt right. The land and those who lived upon it moved together, shaping one another through attention rather than force. And beneath it all, winter remained present only as memory, a reminder of cold floors, of dim light, of careful portions and long nights. That memory did not darken the present. It softened it. It taught appreciation without excess, care without fear, rest without guilt. This was how life endured in medieval times, not through dramatic moments, not through sudden triumph, but through quiet consistency, through waking and working, through tending and waiting, through resting when rest was needed. As the season eased onward, the world seemed to settle into a deep, reassuring steadiness. Nothing demanded attention all at once. Nothing pulled sharply at the senses. Instead, life unfolded in layers so gentle that it was easy to lose track of time, to feel carried rather than moved. Days blended together softly. Morning light arrived warm and familiar, brushing across fields and rooftops in quiet waves. The sound of birds had become constant now, no longer noticed individually, just part of the air itself. People woke rested, their bodies accustomed again to natural rhythms, sleep when it was dark, wake when the light returned. Work continued without strain. Hands moved through familiar motions, lifting, planting, guiding, repairing. Muscles worked steadily, not pushed to their limits, but used fully and wisely. There was comfort in repetition, comfort in knowing what came next and trusting that it would be enough. The land responded generously. Fields grew thicker, greener. The promise of future harvests showed itself quietly in swelling leaves and firm stems. No one celebrated these signs loudly. They were simply acknowledged, accepted with calm satisfaction. Animals thrived in the open air. They moved freely now, no longer confined by winter shelter. Their routines were predictable and soothing. Watching them graze or rest became a small moment of pause in the day, a reminder that life did not need to be hurried to be productive. Homes felt lived in rather than endured. Windows stayed open through most of the day. Light traveled across walls and floors, changing slowly as hours passed. The scent of fresh air replaced the lingering smell of smoke. The hearth remained part of daily life, but it no longer defined it. Meals were unremarkable in the best way. Food appeared regularly. It was prepared with care, eaten with presence, then cleared without ceremony. No one lingered over the table unnecessarily, and no one rushed away. Eating was simply another part of the day, balanced and calm. Children continued to grow within this rhythm. They learned patience without being taught. They learned observation by watching. They learned care by participating. Their days were filled with movement and quiet discovery, and their evenings ended in easy rest. The village existed as a whole, not as individuals moving separately, but as parts of a shared environment. Sounds overlapped gently: footsteps, voices, animals, tools. No single sound dominated. Together, they created a constant, soothing backdrop. Evenings brought a familiar peace. As the sun lowered, its warmth softened rather than disappeared. People slowed naturally, their bodies responding to light rather than obligation. Work ended without urgency. Whatever remained would be there tomorrow. The hearth glowed gently. Its light reflected in calm faces, in walls worn smooth by years of touch. Sometimes stories were told, quietly and without drama. Sometimes only the fire spoke, its soft crackle enough. Nights settled in comfortably. The air cooled gradually. Windows were adjusted, doors secured without haste. The village quieted as one, not through command, but through shared instinct. Sleep came deeply. Bodies rested without tension, minds loosened their hold on thought. Dreams, if they came, were light and fleeting, dissolving easily into the calm of the night. Nature continued its slow, patient work. Growth followed unseen patterns. Rain fell when needed. Wind moved through leaves, shaping sound more than sight. Everything felt balanced, held gently in place. And always, beneath the surface of this calm life, the knowledge of winter remained. It lived quietly in habits and awareness, in the way food was valued, in the way warmth was appreciated, in the way rest was respected. Winter had taught restraint. Spring offered renewal, and life moved forward between them. This was the quiet truth of surviving medieval winters. Not a single moment of triumph, but a long practice of patience, a willingness to endure cold nights, to trust returning light, to find peace in small, steady comforts. As time passed almost unnoticed, the days began to carry a fullness that felt both gentle and complete. There was no sense of rushing toward the future, no marking of milestones. Life simply continued, one quiet day folding into the next, each carrying the same steady reassurance. Morning routines remained familiar. People rose, stretched, and stepped into the day without hesitation. The air felt mild against the skin, neither cold nor heavy. Dew clung briefly to grass and leaves, catching early light before disappearing. These small details were noticed without comment, absorbed as part of the waking world. Work unfolded as it always had. Hands returned to fields, to animals, to tools worn smooth from years of use. The body remembered what to do, moving with efficiency born of repetition. There was no struggle against the day, only participation in it. Tasks were completed not to finish them, but because they belonged to the rhythm of living. The land continued to offer quiet reassurance. Plants stood stronger now, their growth steady and confident. The earth felt warm and responsive beneath hands and feet. Every sign suggested continuity rather than uncertainty. Nothing promised abundance outright, but everything hinted at enough. Animals moved calmly through their routines. They grazed, rested, shifted with the sun. Their presence was grounding, their needs simple and understood. Caring for them felt less like responsibility and more like shared existence. Inside the home, stillness returned often. After tasks were completed, people paused. They sat near doorways, mended clothing, sharpened tools, or simply watched light move across the floor. These pauses were not wasted time. They were part of living, moments where nothing needed to happen. Meals came and went quietly. Food was prepared, eaten, and cleaned away without ceremony. Hunger no longer shaped thought, and fullness did not demand attention. Eating was simply another calm transition between parts of the day. Children moved freely within this world. They learned limits naturally, guided by observation and gentle correction. Their energy found balance through long hours outdoors and restful evenings indoors. Sleep claimed them easily, their days full without being overwhelming. The village breathed as one. Movement slowed and quickened together. Sounds rose and fell in unison. There was no sharp division between work and rest, between private and shared life. Everything overlapped softly, creating a sense of belonging that required no explanation. Evenings remained a quiet anchor. As daylight faded, the world softened. Colors dimmed gradually. Shadows stretched without drama. People turned inward without resistance, adjusting their pace as the light guided them. The hearth offered gentle warmth. Its presence was comforting rather than commanding. It reminded everyone of winters endured, without bringing back their weight. The fire was a companion now, not a necessity. Night arrived without tension. Doors were closed, windows adjusted, animals settled. The village grew quiet not suddenly, but as if drifting into a shared breath. Sounds diminished naturally, leaving only the soft background of the world at rest. Sleep followed easily. Bodies rested deeply, supported by routine and nourishment. The mind released its hold on thought, trusting the steadiness of the days ahead. Dreams, if they came, were light, passing through without leaving a mark. And beneath all of this calm continuity lived the memory of winter. Not sharp, not heavy, just present. It shaped choices gently. It encouraged care. It reminded people to notice warmth, light, and rest. Surviving winter in medieval times was never about dramatic struggle alone. It was about patience, about endurance, about trusting the slow return of the sun. And as the seasons turned and life settled once more into balance, that patience remained, woven quietly into daily life. As the gentle cycle of days carried on, there came a time when the land felt fully settled into itself. Nothing new announced its arrival, and nothing departed suddenly. Instead, life rested in a calm middle space, where each moment felt familiar, yet never dull. The mornings remained unhurried. Light entered homes softly, filtering through shutters and cloth, waking sleepers without demand. People stirred slowly, listening for a moment before rising, to birds outside, to distant movement, to the quiet presence of the day waiting patiently. There was no urgency to begin. The world was ready when they were. Hands returned to work with ease. Tools were lifted, baskets carried, animals guided gently along known paths. Movements required little thought now. The body remembered. There was comfort in this knowing, a sense that effort no longer needed explanation. Work was simply something done, like breathing, like walking. The fields held their shape. Plants stood firm, leaves full, stems strong. The soil felt warm and responsive beneath careful fingers. Each time someone knelt to tend a row, it felt less like labor and more like conversation, an ongoing exchange between human care and the quiet generosity of the earth. Animals remained steady companions. They moved in predictable ways, responding to light, sound, and routine. Their presence grounded the day, offering reassurance through constancy. Watching them graze or rest became a quiet pause in the flow of time, a moment of stillness that required nothing in return. Homes felt open and lived in. Air moved freely through doorways and windows. Light touched familiar surfaces, revealing the gentle wear of years, smooth wooden edges, softened floors, walls marked by time. These signs were not flaws. They were evidence of continuity, of life unfolding steadily within these spaces. Meals continued without emphasis. Food was prepared, shared, and cleared away as part of the natural rhythm. There was satisfaction without indulgence, nourishment without excess. Eating did not interrupt the day. It supported it, quietly and reliably. Children grew within this calm structure. They learned not through instruction, but through presence. By watching adults move through tasks, by listening to the world around them. Their understanding deepened naturally, shaped by repetition and gentle guidance. The village existed in quiet harmony. People moved in and out of one another's days without ceremony. Help was offered when needed, accepted without hesitation. No one stood alone for long. Community lived in these small, unspoken exchanges. Evenings remained a time of soft gathering. As daylight eased away, people slowed naturally. Work ended not because it was finished, but because the day had reached its gentle close. The sky dimmed gradually, inviting rest without command. The hearth glowed faintly. Its warmth was subtle, its light steady. It framed the room rather than filled it, offering comfort without demand. Sometimes words were spoken. Sometimes silence filled the space completely, and that silence felt full rather than empty. Night settled like a familiar blanket. Doors were closed quietly. Windows adjusted slightly. Animals settled into rest. The village breathed together, exhaling the day in a shared, unspoken rhythm. Sleep came without effort. Bodies rested deeply, accustomed to balance and routine. The mind softened its grip on thought, trusting the steadiness of tomorrow. Dreams drifted lightly, if they came at all, passing through without disturbance. And always, woven gently through this peaceful life, remained the understanding shaped by winter, an awareness of fragility, an appreciation for warmth, a respect for rest. Winter had demanded patience. Spring had returned reward, and life moved forward between them, balanced and whole. This quiet endurance defined medieval survival, not through constant struggle, not through dramatic moments, but through living attentively, day after day. As the calm rhythm of days continued, time itself seemed to soften, losing its sharp edges. There was no clear line between one day and the next, only a gentle blending, like colors meeting at the horizon. Life moved forward quietly, carried by habit, observation, and an unspoken trust in the turning of seasons. Morning light remained kind. It arrived without insistence, sliding across fields and rooftops, touching faces still half asleep. People woke gradually, taking a moment to lie still, listening to the village breathe. Somewhere a door creaked open. Somewhere an animal shifted in its sleep. These sounds were familiar, comforting, and unremarkable. The day unfolded naturally. No one needed to be reminded of what must be done. Tasks waited patiently, just as the people approached them patiently. A fence was checked. A tool was repaired. A path was cleared. Each small effort fit neatly into the larger shape of the day. The land felt dependable. Soil held warmth. Plants responded to care. Growth continued at a pace that felt right, not hurried, not slow. Each sign of life carried reassurance, not excitement. There was comfort in knowing that nothing needed to be forced. Animals remained calm and steady. They followed routines shaped by instinct and care. Their presence filled the day with gentle movement and sound. Tending to them felt less like duty and more like shared existence, each dependent on the other in quiet balance. Homes offered rest without confinement. They were places to pause, to eat, to sleep, to gather. Doors stood open more often than closed. Light and air moved freely through familiar spaces. The walls held memories, but no weight. Meals remained simple and grounding. Food was prepared thoughtfully, eaten slowly, and appreciated without words. There was no need to discuss it, no need to dwell on it. It was enough, and that was sufficient. Children continued to grow into this steady world. They learned by doing, by watching, by listening. Their understanding deepened not through instruction, but through time. They absorbed the rhythm of life around them, carrying it forward without effort. The village remained gently connected. People crossed paths often, sharing brief moments without interruption. Help was given quietly. Needs were met naturally. Community existed in the spaces between words, in the familiarity of faces and movements. Evenings softened everything. Light faded gradually, turning the world inward. The air cooled just enough to be noticed. People slowed their movements, responding to the change without thought. The hearth glowed softly. Its presence was steady, reassuring. It spoke of continuity, of winters endured and warmth returned. Its light flickered gently across the room, marking time in a way that felt timeless. Night arrived peacefully. The village settled into quiet without effort. Doors closed. Windows adjusted. Animals stilled. The world rested together, held in a shared calm. Sleep followed naturally. Bodies released the day. Muscles loosened. Breathing deepened. The mind drifted gently, no longer holding tightly to thought or worry. And always, beneath this peaceful unfolding, the memory of winter remained. Not as fear, not as strain, but as understanding. It shaped life gently, encouraging care, patience, and appreciation. It reminded people that comfort was earned and therefore precious. Surviving winter in medieval times was never just about enduring cold. It was about learning to live slowly, to observe carefully, to trust the return of light. As the flow of days carried on, the sense of time grew even softer, almost transparent. Hours no longer felt separate from one another. They blended gently, shaped more by light and shadow than by thought. Life moved forward without needing to be named, guided by rhythms older than memory. Morning came again, as it always did. Light slipped quietly into the village, touching stone, wood, and earth with a warmth that felt familiar now. People woke without alarm, without hurry. There was a brief moment of stillness before rising, a moment to simply exist, listening to the low, steady sounds of life continuing outside. The day accepted them calmly. There was work to do, as there always was, but it did not press or demand. It waited. Fields, animals, tools, and paths were patient. Each task fit naturally into the shape of the morning, unfolding one after another without resistance. Hands moved confidently. They lifted, guided, repaired, and tended. Muscles worked with ease, shaped by years of repetition. There was no struggle against the body, no forcing of energy. Effort was steady and measured, leaving room for breath and pause. The land offered quiet assurance. Plants grew stronger, their presence steady and unremarkable. Leaves caught the light. Stems held firm. The soil responded to care without surprise. Everything suggested continuity, a promise not spoken aloud but deeply felt. Animals remained gentle companions. They followed their routines faithfully, responding to voice, touch, and time of day. Caring for them was woven seamlessly into life, neither burden nor afterthought. Their calm presence anchored the day, grounding it in something real and tangible. Homes continued to feel open and restful. Light moved slowly across familiar spaces, marking the passage of hours without urgency. Air flowed freely, carrying the scent of earth and greenery inside. The hearth rested quietly, ready when needed, but no longer central. Meals came and went peacefully. Food was prepared with care, eaten without distraction, and cleared away gently. No one lingered unnecessarily, and no one rushed. Nourishment was simply part of the rhythm, supporting life quietly. Children moved through the day naturally. They learned through watching, through doing, through being present. Their understanding grew without effort, shaped by the steady example of the world around them. Their days were full, but never overwhelming. The village continued its gentle harmony. People crossed paths without interruption. Voices rose and fell softly. Help was offered without announcement. Needs were noticed and met quietly. Community existed in the ease of shared space and shared time. Evenings arrived like a soft sigh. The light faded gradually, drawing the world inward. People slowed their movements instinctively, guided by the sky rather than the clock. Work ended without regret, knowing it would continue another day. The hearth glowed faintly. Its warmth was subtle, its light calm. It gathered people without pulling them close. Sometimes words were shared, sometimes not. Silence was welcome, comfortable, complete. Nights settled without disturbance. Doors were closed gently. Windows adjusted slightly. Animals stilled. The village quieted as one, slipping naturally into rest. Sleep came deeply. Bodies relaxed fully. Breath slowed. Thoughts softened, then drifted away. Dreams, if they appeared, passed lightly, leaving no trace. And always, beneath this steady calm, lived the understanding shaped by winter. A knowledge of cold remembered without pain. A respect for warmth never taken for granted. A patience learned through long nights and careful days. Surviving winter in medieval times was not only about endurance. It was about learning to move with the world. To wait when waiting was required. To rest when rest was offered. The season pressed on, day after day, without urgency and without pause. Winter did not announce itself with drama once it had fully arrived. Instead, it settled into every corner of life, filling the hours with repetition and quiet expectation. In medieval homes, people learned to live closer to stillness. Movements were slower now, not from laziness, but from necessity. Every step taken on frozen ground required balance and care. Every trip outdoors demanded preparation. Cloaks wrapped tightly, breath drawn slowly, eyes scanning the path ahead for hidden ice. Inside, the air was thick with the familiar sense of smoke, wool, and stored food. These smells blended together so completely that they became invisible, part of the background of existence. Only when spring returned would anyone notice their absence. Winter light entered homes reluctantly. It slipped through narrow windows in pale, slanted beams, barely warming the floor before retreating again. Dust motes drifted through this light, turning slowly, as if time itself had slowed enough to be seen. People arranged their lives around this fragile brightness. Tasks that required focus were done early, while the sun still lingered. As darkness crept back in, work softened into quieter activities, hands still moving, but minds beginning to rest. Firewood stacks shrank gradually. Each missing log was noticed. Each addition to the flames was deliberate. Children were taught to respect the fire from a young age, warned gently but firmly of its importance. Fire was not just warmth, it was survival shaped into light. Ashes were saved carefully, reused when possible. Even waste had value. Nothing was discarded thoughtlessly in winter. The cold shaped bodies as much as habits. Fingers stiffened easily. Joints ached more often. Elders moved slowly, conserving strength. Children learned to keep their hands tucked into sleeves, their breath steady and controlled. Sleep offered relief, but not escape. Even at night, winter was present, in the chill that crept under blankets, in the way breath condensed in the air, in the faint groan of wood contracting as temperatures dropped. Dreams came softly, influenced by routine and repetition. There were no glowing screens to overstimulate the mind, no constant noise. Instead, the rhythm of days guided thoughts gently toward rest. Outside, the village existed in quiet companionship. Smoke rising from chimneys was both a signal and a comfort, proof that others nearby were awake, enduring the same cold, tending the same fires. Occasionally, a door would open, releasing a brief rush of warmth and light into the snowy air before closing again. These small moments connected households without words. Snowfall varied in temperament. Sometimes it arrived gently, almost politely, drifting down in silence. Other times, it fell heavier, driven sideways by wind, reshaping the world overnight. Familiar paths vanished. Landmarks softened until everything looked the same. People adapted. They memorized the feel of the ground beneath their feet. They learned to navigate by fences, trees, and walls rather than sight alone. Sound carried differently in winter. Voices seemed closer, sharper. A distant call could travel across fields without resistance. But silence, when it came, was profound. In that silence, people listened. They listened for animals moving in barns, for changes in the wind, for the subtle crack of ice shifting beneath snow. These sounds were not alarming. They were informative, guiding decisions and caution. Food stores continued to dictate daily choices. Meals were adjusted based on what remained. Thicker stews became thinner. Bread loaves became smaller. Still, meals were shared evenly. Fairness maintained even when portions dwindled. Hunger, when it appeared, was accepted quietly. Complaints served no purpose. Instead, people drank warm liquids, rested more, and trusted that endurance would carry them forward. The church, when accessible, offered both physical and emotional shelter. Stone walls held warmth surprisingly well when crowded with bodies. Candles glowed softly against worn icons and murals, their colors muted by age and smoke. Prayers were spoken slowly, not always out of devotion, but out of habit and comfort. Familiar words steadied the mind. Ritual provided structure when days felt indistinguishable. Illness remained an ever-present concern. A cough was watched carefully. A fever prompted immediate rest. Herbal infusions were prepared from dried plants saved months earlier, each one valued and measured. Care was communal. Neighbors checked in quietly. Food was shared when possible. Labor was redistributed when someone fell ill. Survival depended on cooperation as much as strength. Winter tested relationships gently but persistently. Close quarters amplified emotions. Patience was learned through necessity. Conflicts, when they arose, were softened by exhaustion and the understanding that harmony conserved energy. Children continued to grow even in winter. Their clothes grew tighter. Their questions grew deeper. They learned about restraint, responsibility, and rhythm simply by observing those around them. Education was informal, woven into daily life. Skills were passed hand to hand, word to ear. Winter, with its slower pace, allowed time for teaching that summer never offered. Crafts flourished. Spinning wheels turned steadily. Needles moved through fabric with practiced ease. Carved objects emerged slowly from blocks of wood, shaped by careful hands and patient attention. These objects were not decorative luxuries. They were tools, clothing, containers, things meant to last, to serve, to be repaired rather than replaced. The value of durability became deeply ingrained. Outside, animals adapted in their own ways. Livestock grew thicker coats. Chickens clustered together for warmth. Wild animals moved closer to human settlements, drawn by scraps and shelter. Tracks in the snow told quiet stories. A fox passing through at night, a deer crossing cautiously, a hare darting between hedges. These signs were read with interest, sometimes with concern, always with respect. The moon became more noticeable in winter. With fewer leaves and longer nights, its presence felt stronger, brighter. It cast pale light across snow-covered fields, turning darkness into silver. Stars seemed sharper, clearer, unfiltered by summer haze. People noticed patterns, constellations passed down through generations, used not just for navigation but for storytelling. Winter nights invited reflection. Without constant distraction, minds wandered gently. People thought about past winters, about those who had endured them before, about seasons yet to come. Memory became a source of warmth. As the weeks passed, subtle changes appeared. The light shifted almost imperceptibly. Days grew longer by minutes that most wouldn't consciously notice, but felt nonetheless. Snow melted briefly on rooftops during midday, only to refreeze by evening. Icicles grew and fell. Water flowed a little more freely beneath ice. These signs were small, fragile, but meaningful. Hope did not arrive as excitement. It arrived as quiet reassurance. Spring was not yet present, but it was no longer unimaginable. Winter loosened its grip gradually, never all at once. Cold remained, but it softened. The world breathed a little easier. And through it all, medieval people continued as they always had, tending fires, sharing meals, repairing tools, telling stories, sleeping deeply beneath layers of wool and time. They did not romanticize winter. They did not resent it endlessly. They accepted it, because winter, for them, was not a story with a climax. It was a long, steady passage, a season to be lived through slowly, a test of patience rather than bravery. And as the fire burned low and embers glowed softly beneath ash, life carried on, quiet, persistent, and unbroken, just as it always had. As winter stretched on, the sense of time became less about dates and more about patterns. People no longer counted days. They noticed instead how often the fire needed tending, how quickly shadows lengthened across the floor, how long breath lingered in the air before fading. Morning arrived quietly. There were no alarms, no urgency. The household stirred when light suggested it was time. Someone rose to stir the embers, careful not to wake others too quickly, easing the day into motion rather than forcing it. The cold had a particular texture in medieval winters. It pressed gently but persistently against skin, seeping through wool and linen, settling into bone. People learned how to move within it, how to preserve warmth by keeping motion steady and deliberate. Water remained a daily challenge. Ice formed quickly overnight, even inside buckets left too near the door. Breaking it required patience and care, the sound of cracking ice echoing briefly before returning to silence. These small acts repeated each day, becoming so familiar that they no longer felt burdensome. Meals continued to reflect the season's limitations. Whatever remained from autumn stores determined the day's flavor. There was little choice, but there was comfort in predictability. The same foods, prepared in the same way, offered reassurance that life was stable, even if it was austere. Inside the home, objects took on greater meaning. A wooden spoon smoothed by years of use. A blanket patched so many times its original fabric was barely visible. These things carried memory, linking present moments to those who had lived through winters before. Children grew adept at quiet play. They carved shapes from scrap wood, traced patterns in ash, invented games from nothing at all. Their laughter, when it came, was soft and brief, as if instinctively aware of the need to conserve energy and sound. Adults watched over them with calm attention, correcting gently, teaching without formal lessons. Knowledge passed naturally, embedded in daily life rather than set apart from it. The boundaries between work and rest blurred. A person might pause mid-task to warm hands near the fire, then return without urgency. Productivity was measured not in output, but in sustainability. Clothing dried slowly near the hearth, steam rising faintly from damp wool. The smell of wet fabric mixed with smoke and ash, a scent so common it went unnoticed. Outside, snow hardened underfoot, forming a crust that cracked softly with each step. Travel, when necessary, was planned carefully. No one ventured far without reason. The world had shrunk, and people adapted by living more fully within its reduced boundaries. The village functioned as a single organism in winter. When one household struggled, others noticed. Support was offered quietly, without ceremony. Survival was understood as a shared responsibility. Livestock remained central to daily concern. Animals represented warmth, food, and future security. Their health was monitored closely. A sick cow or injured sheep was not just a loss, it was a threat to stability. People spoke to animals more in winter, voices low and steady. Whether from habit or belief, these words seemed to matter, calming both human and beast. Evenings settled in early. The sky darkened while tasks were still unfinished, forcing people to accept limits. Darkness was not fought. It was acknowledged and accommodated. Candles were lit sparingly. Firelight did most of the work, casting long shadows that danced slowly across walls and ceilings. These shifting shapes became familiar companions, silent and ever-present. Stories continued to pass from mouth to ear. Not grand tales of conquest, but small ones, about weather remembered, about winters endured, about moments of kindness that lingered in memory long after details faded. These stories reinforced patience. They reminded listeners that hardship was temporary, that survival was possible, that they were not alone in their experience. Sleep came more easily after such evenings. Bodies tired from cold and routine settled into rest quickly. Breathing slowed. Thoughts softened. Outside, frost crept deeper into the ground, sealing seeds beneath its surface. Life paused, waiting. The forest stood bare, but not lifeless. Beneath snow and ice, roots rested, sap slowed, animals hibernated. Medieval people sensed this hidden activity, understanding that stillness did not mean absence. They trusted in cycles. The moon rose and set, marking time more reliably than any clock. Its phases were observed casually, woven into conversation, linked to tasks and expectations. Wind patterns were noticed. A shift in direction carried meaning, a promise of snow, a warning of cold, a hint of change. Winter weather shaped not only daily routines, but thought itself. People became more inward, reflective. Words were chosen carefully. Silence was accepted without discomfort. Faith, whether formal or personal, deepened in winter. Not always as devotion, but as a framework for understanding endurance. Rituals provided rhythm. Prayer offered stillness. Even those less inclined toward belief found comfort in repetition, in the familiar structure of days that began and ended the same way. As weeks passed, subtle transformations continued. Snow settled differently. Light changed angle. Birds returned briefly during milder days, their presence noted with quiet satisfaction. Children pointed these signs out, eager to notice change. Adults smiled softly, acknowledging hope without celebrating prematurely. Winter was cautious with its promises. Food supplies were checked again and again. Each remaining sack, each hanging cut of meat, represented careful planning. Waste was unthinkable, yet generosity persisted. A bowl of soup shared, a loaf divided. These acts were small, but significant, reinforcing bonds that mattered more than abundance. Hands grew rougher, skin cracked by cold and work. These marks were worn without complaint, accepted as part of life. Time continued to pass. The world remained hushed, contained, patient. The days continued to unfold with the same gentle predictability, each one resembling the last, yet never feeling entirely the same. Small variations gave each day its own quiet character. A slightly warmer breeze near midday, a heavier frost in the morning, a softer snowfall that muted the village even further. People noticed these differences instinctively. They did not record them, but they felt them. The body remembered yesterday's cold and adjusted to today's. Hands reached for cloaks before the mind fully decided to move. Inside the home, the fire remained the steady heart of life. It was watched constantly, not with anxiety, but with respect. Too little attention, and it faded. Too much fuel, and resources dwindled too quickly. Maintaining balance was a skill learned through experience rather than instruction. Ash was cleared carefully each morning, embers stirred just enough to wake them. A faint glow beneath gray powder brought quiet relief. The fire was alive again, and with it, the day could begin. The sounds of winter were subtle. Wood popping softly in the hearth, the scrape of a bowl against a table, footsteps crunching outside, deliberate and slow. These sounds formed a steady background, never demanding attention, always reassuring in their familiarity. Conversation was sparse but meaningful. Words were not wasted. People spoke when there was something to say, and silence filled the rest comfortably. Long pauses were not awkward. They were expected. Children grew accustomed to this rhythm. They learned when to speak, when to listen, when to simply observe. Winter was a teacher of restraint. Clothing repairs became almost constant. Sleeves wore thin at the elbows, hems frayed, buttons loosened. Each flaw was addressed patiently, needle moving in steady patterns, thread pulled tight with care. These repairs were not temporary fixes. They were meant to last. Every stitch carried intention. Food preparation remained simple but thoughtful. Bones were boiled repeatedly, extracting every bit of nourishment. Leftover bread was soaked, softened, transformed into something new. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could be replaced. The taste of meals mattered less than the warmth they provided. Steam rising from a bowl was comfort enough. Outside, the sky often remained overcast, a blanket of gray pressing low over the land. When the sun appeared, even briefly, it was noticed immediately. Faces turned toward it without thinking. The warmth, faint as it was, felt generous. Snow reflected light upward, brightening even cloudy days. The world appeared pale and softened, edges blurred, as if nature itself had slowed its focus. Travel between villages remained rare. When someone did arrive from afar, their presence was notable. News traveled slowly, and any update from beyond the familiar boundaries was listened to carefully, even if it brought nothing urgent. Often, the news was simply that winter was the same elsewhere. People nodded, understanding that this shared experience connected them to countless others enduring similar days in similar homes. Animals continued to shape daily routines. Their needs dictated movement, timing, effort. Feeding times were observed faithfully. Stalls were checked even late at night during extreme cold. Animals offered quiet companionship. Their presence grounded people, reminding them that life persisted beyond human concerns. The smell of hay and warm breath filled enclosed spaces, creating an atmosphere that felt oddly safe despite its roughness. Nightfall came swiftly. Once darkness settled, activities slowed further. The fire was banked. Candles were extinguished early. Energy was conserved instinctively. People slept longer in winter, allowing their bodies to recover from cold and labor. Dreams often mirrored daily life. Fire, snow, movement, repetition. The outside world faded completely during sleep, reduced to distant sounds and faint light filtering through cracks. Illness appeared sporadically, never announced, always watched closely. Recovery was slow but possible. Care was steady and gentle, not rushed. People understood limits. They rested when rest was needed. Pushing too hard in winter carried consequences. Time passed in layers rather than lines. Weeks folded into one another. Memory of early winter began to blur, replaced by the immediate present. Yet, beneath this sameness, anticipation quietly grew. Not excitement, but awareness. The sun lingered just a little longer each day. Shadows shifted almost imperceptibly. Snow softened at midday, growing heavier, wetter. These signs were not celebrated loudly. They were acknowledged with calm nods, with glances exchanged over the fire. Hope was practical. Winter still ruled, but its authority no longer felt absolute. People continued as they always had, working, resting, sharing space, sharing silence. Life remained small, contained, resilient. Winter lingered with a calm persistence that shaped thought as much as action. There was no sense of being trapped in the season, only the understanding that this was where life currently resided. The outside world moved slowly, and so did the inner world of those living within it. In the early hours before dawn, the village rested beneath a layer of stillness so complete it felt deliberate. Snow absorbed sound, frost held movement in place, and even the wind seemed to pause between breaths. Inside homes, people slept deeply, their bodies pressed close together, sharing warmth instinctively. When waking came, it was gentle. Eyes opened slowly. Limbs moved cautiously, testing the air. Someone would sit up, pulling a blanket tighter, listening for familiar sounds that indicated the household was stirring. The fire was always the first concern. A hand reached toward the hearth, brushing aside ash to reveal the quiet glow beneath. A small piece of kindling was placed carefully, breath held as the ember responded, catching slowly, bringing light back into the room. This small success set the tone for the day. Warmth returned gradually, not all at once. Fingers relaxed. Breath softened. The space felt alive again. Morning tasks followed familiar patterns. Water was checked, ice broken if needed. Animals were fed, their movements slow and cooperative, accustomed now to the cold. Their breath rose in pale clouds, mingling with human breath in shared spaces. The line between human and animal life felt thinner in winter. Survival depended on attention to all living things within reach. Food preparation began quietly. Pots were lifted. Grain was measured carefully. Each portion was calculated, not by written record, but by memory and experience. People knew how long winter could last, and they planned accordingly. As the day brightened slightly, light filtered in through narrow openings, catching on dust and smoke. These brief moments of illumination were used well. Sewing, mending, carving, all tasks requiring detail were addressed while visibility allowed. Hands moved with practiced ease. There was no rush. Time, in winter, was something to inhabit rather than manage. Children watched these movements closely. They learned not through instruction, but through repetition and observation. A child handed a tool when it was needed. Another learned to spin wool by imitating the rhythm of an elder's hands. Mistakes were corrected gently. Winter left little energy for frustration. Outside, the landscape remained subdued. Snow softened the contours of fields and paths, making distance harder to judge. Trees stood bare, their branches etched against the sky like ink lines on parchment. Occasionally, snow fell again, lightly at first, then more steadily. The sound was barely noticeable, a faint hush settling over everything. People responded instinctively, closing shutters, checking roofs, ensuring animals were sheltered. These actions were automatic, woven into daily life by years of repetition. Inside, the smell of food cooking filled the air slowly. There was no sharp hunger, only the steady anticipation of warmth and nourishment. When meals were ready, they were eaten without ceremony, shared evenly, appreciated quietly. Afterward, bowls were scraped clean. Utensils were wiped carefully. Nothing remained unused. Afternoons passed in steady labor. Wood was split if the weather allowed. Supplies were reorganized. Tools were sharpened, their edges restored with patient strokes. Conversation drifted in and out. Sometimes stories emerged naturally, triggered by an object or a memory. Other times, silence prevailed, comfortable and expected. Silence did not mean emptiness. It was filled with awareness, of breath, of sound, of the presence of others. As daylight faded again, people adjusted without complaint. Work slowed. Movement softened. The fire became the center of attention once more. Shadows lengthened across the floor, stretching toward the walls. Faces glowed warmly in firelight. Features softened, expressions calm. Children settled near the hearth, listening, watching flames dance. Adults prepared for night, securing doors, checking animals one final time, banking the fire carefully. Outside, the temperature dropped further. Ice crept back across surfaces that had softened earlier. The world reset itself for another long night. Sleep came steadily. Bodies, accustomed now to the rhythm of winter, surrendered easily to rest. Breath slowed. Muscles relaxed. Night was not feared. It was simply another phase of the cycle. Dreams unfolded gently, shaped by repetition and familiarity. Images of fire, snow, routine, and shared spaces blended together. Morning returned again, quietly, without announcement. And so winter continued. Weeks passed like this, each one echoing the last, yet subtly different. People adapted continuously, adjusting small habits to match changing conditions. When a sudden thaw arrived, it was noticed immediately. Snow softened, slush formed, water dripped from eaves. The change brought new challenges, slippery paths, damp clothing, heavier air. People responded calmly. They adjusted footwear. They dried garments carefully. They adapted once more. When cold returned, it was accepted just as easily. The body learned resilience. The mind learned patience. Elders spoke less now, conserving energy, but when they did speak, others listened. Their memories of past winters carried weight, offering reassurance that endurance was possible. Children continued to grow, even in the cold. Their resilience amazed adults, reminding them that life persisted regardless of season. The village endured not through strength alone, but through rhythm, cooperation, and acceptance. Winter did not need to be conquered. It only needed to be lived within. And so the days continued, steady and quiet, shaped by frost and fire, by shared space and shared silence, moving forward without urgency, without conclusion, simply existing within the long, slow passage of the medieval winter. The cold returned again with familiar certainty, settling into the village as if it had never loosened its hold. Any brief softness in the air was forgotten, absorbed into memory like a dream that faded upon waking. Life adjusted without complaint. Cloaks were drawn tighter. Fires were fed a little more often. Movement slowed again, returning to the steady cadence winter demanded. Morning followed its usual pattern. The house stirred gradually, each sound emerging in sequence. The quiet shifting of blankets, the soft clearing of a throat, the scrape of a stool across the floor. No one hurried. There was no reason to. The day would unfold as it always did, shaped by the same needs and limits. The hearth responded faithfully. Embers stirred, flames coaxed back to life with patient breath. The room brightened just enough to reveal familiar shapes, beams overhead, tools resting where they had been left, garments folded neatly nearby. Nothing had changed, and that constancy brought comfort. Outside, frost coated every surface once more. It clung to door frames and fence posts, traced patterns along the edges of roofs, transformed ordinary objects into fragile sculptures. These details were noticed briefly, then accepted, becoming part of the landscape once again. Animals greeted the day quietly. Their movements were slow, deliberate, conserving warmth. Feed was distributed evenly, water checked, and broken free from ice. Hands moved efficiently, guided by habit rather than thought. Inside, the preparation of food resumed. Grain was ground, measured carefully, mixed with water and heat. Steam rose gently, filling the room with warmth that lingered on skin and clothing. Meals remained simple, but they nourished both body and routine. Children gathered close, drawn to the warmth and the quiet activity. They absorbed the rhythm of work without instruction, learning how life moved in winter simply by being present within it. As the day progressed, light filtered in briefly, touching the floor before retreating again. Tasks adjusted accordingly. Sewing paused when eyes tired. Carving slowed when shadows grew too long. No one lamented the darkness. It was expected, accounted for, woven into daily planning. Afternoons passed without clear division from morning. Time stretched gently, unmarked by urgency. People worked until they felt the need to rest, then resumed when ready. The body set the pace, and the pace was respected. Occasionally, someone stepped outside to check conditions, returning with cheeks flushed and breath visible. These brief encounters with the cold sharpened appreciation for the warmth inside. Snow fell again, lightly at first, then more steadily. It layered itself over existing drifts, smoothing the world once more. Sound faded further. Even the village seemed to draw inward. Inside, conversation drifted quietly. A memory surfaced. A small observation was shared. Laughter appeared briefly, then settled back into calm. Nothing was exaggerated. Emotions were held gently, just as resources were. As evening approached, routines tightened. Animals were secured. Doors were checked. The fire was tended carefully, banked to last through the night. Supper was eaten slowly, without distraction. Each mouthful warmed. Each swallow eased hunger just enough. Afterward, bowls were cleaned, set aside. Hands were wiped. Bodies shifted closer to the hearth as the room cooled. Stories emerged again, not planned, simply remembered. Tales of winters long past, of storms endured, of days that felt endless at the time, but now existed only as softened recollections. These stories did not frighten. They reassured. Sleep followed naturally. People settled where they always did, adjusting blankets, sharing warmth. Breath synchronized. Muscles released tension built from cold and effort. Outside, the world rested beneath snow and sky, And inside, life continued quietly, unchanged, patient, shaped by the season that held it, moving forward one steady moment at a time. And now, as the long day finally releases its hold, the story begins to slow even more, easing gently toward rest. The village settles into stillness. The last traces of light fade from the sky, leaving behind a deep, quiet blue. Fields lie undisturbed, plants resting after a day of steady growth. Animals are calm and silent, curled into familiar places where they feel safe and warm. Paths that were walked so often during the day now lie empty, waiting patiently for morning. Inside the homes, the hearth glows low. Its fire is no longer needed for warmth, only for comfort. The flames move slowly, lazily, casting soft shadows that stretch and soften across the walls. The air is calm. Everything feels complete, exactly as it should be. People lie down to sleep without worry. Their bodies are tired in the best possible way, shaped by gentle work and fresh air. Hands that spent the day tending earth now rest easily. Muscles loosen. Breath slows. There is no need to think ahead, no need to prepare or plan. Tomorrow will come when it comes. The memory of winter drifts quietly through the mind. Not as hardship, not as fear, but as a distant understanding. Cold nights, dim mornings, careful meals, long patience. All of it survived. All of it endured. And because of that endurance, this moment of calm exists. This warmth, this stillness, this gentle sense of safety. Surviving winter in medieval times was never just about resisting the cold. It was about learning how to live slowly, how to wait, how to trust the quiet return of light. Those lessons remain, even now, resting softly beneath the surface of everyday life, guiding each breath, each movement, each moment of rest. And as the village sleeps, the world keeps turning gently. The seasons continue their slow dance. The earth rests and renews itself. The future waits patiently, just beyond the horizon. For now, there is nothing more to do. No tasks to complete. No stories left to tell. Only the steady rhythm of breath, the soft hum of a world at rest, and the deep, peaceful quiet that comes when everything has found its place. So allow your thoughts to fade. Let your breathing slow. Let the story drift away like embers settling into ash. And as sleep arrives, calm and unhurried, may you rest as peacefully as those medieval homes after a long winter finally passed. Good night.